Welcome back. Today I'm going to be showing you how to install an add-a-leaf in a leaf spring suspension system. I'm using this 83 Dodge RamCharger, but pretty much anything that uses a leaf sprung system is going to be very similar, if not identical, to this setup. So I'm going to go ahead, show you how to install this, a couple of things to watch for along the way, and yeah, that's it. So I'm just going to show you how to put a leaf spring in. I'm only going to do the one, so we'll start out there. Now, before we do anything, one of the things that I like to do before I do any type of lift or any type of major suspension work is I want to check my ride height. Now, the way that you check ride height, there's a couple different ways you can do it. One is you measure from this fender lip here to the ground. So if you measure from this fender lip to the ground, and you do that at all four corners of the vehicle, you can see kind of how the vehicle sits, all that good stuff, and figure it out from there. And I've done that on this truck, and I can tell you that the driver's front sits quite low. The driver's front sits quite a bit lower than anything else. The driver's rear sits lower than the passenger rear, but I would say that's due mostly to a weak spring on the driver's front. And actually, these Dodges back in the day, they had a recall kit or service kit that basically put a 5/8 inch thick shim onto the bottom of the leaf spring on the driver's front to bring it up. And I think that would actually almost perfectly fix this one. I have a shim made, it's 3/8. I probably should have a thicker one. I'm not sure if I'll use the 3/8 shim or if I'll get a thicker one made. But anyway, always want to check your ride height before and check your ride height after, and that tells you how everything went. Alright, one of the first things here, I've already got the shock disconnected and I've got a stand up underneath the axle. It's not actually touching yet. When you're lifting something to do this, you need to be able to let the suspension totally droop down. So that means you need to lift it on either a frame contacting hoist, or if you're at home doing this on the floor, you need some really tall jack stands to allow the suspension to totally drop out. Now, one of the downsides of this stand that I've got is that it does not work, so I'm going to be working with the so I'm going to end up working with the lift a little bit off the safeties in order to facilitate moving this thing up and down properly. Right now it's on the safeties and it's close, but it's just not going to work, so I'm going to have to run it without safeties a little bit, which you shouldn't really do, but sometimes you have to, and just don't get underneath the vehicle while you're doing that. Another thing that I've already done, this is kind of a tech tip, I took a die and I ran it up the end of the U-bolts, which essentially cleaned out the threads really nice. I then also used some penetrating oil on them. I've been doing that for a few hours now. Normally I don't really use penetrating oil a lot because I'll just heat this and then cut it. So there's a couple different ways you can remove U-bolt. I'm going to try to reuse these, which you're not actually supposed to do. You're supposed to use U-bolts. You're supposed to use new U-bolts every time you loosen them. So that's something I'm doing that I'm not even supposed to. I'm going to try to reuse these U-bolts in the rear, and I think it's probably going to work because I already cleaned up the threads. I've been oiling it, so I'm going to hit them with an impact and they'll probably come loose. Alright, so I know I've mentioned this on this channel before. Sometimes I think the air impacts work better than electric. Whoops. Okay, so I'm going to loosen that one up. I'm actually going to, after I've got it loose, I'm actually going to retighten it and then go to the other one. Retighten it. And the reason why is I want tension on the other three as I'm trying to break the initial rust loose out of all of them. Once I get all four of them moving a little bit, then I'll just remove them. I don't have this really supported yet. It's not going anywhere anyway, but I will have to do that here shortly as well. So I'm going to set this up to the side and I'm going to work these 4 bolts. Okay, so after taking all of those out, the U-bolts are now ready to set off to the side. The spring plate on this Dodge is on the bottom. I've already set it out. I'm going to go ahead and lift the truck up just a touch. Now what that's done is given some space between the U-bolt, or not the U-bolt, between the leaf spring, and on these Dodges they have a factory block which is really stuck to the axle. In this case I should be able to just grab it and move it off of there, but it's rusted in place, and I'm just going to leave it because I don't really need to take it off. So I'm actually going to lift it up a little bit more to drop this down a little bit better. Okay, so now the other side is still hooked up. This block is stuck in place. I'm going to leave it as it's separated at the spot I actually need it to anyway. The next thing I need to do, there was actually a plate that sat up here. This little guy. So this little plate fell off while I was taking it apart, which I need to take that off anyway. So now I've got like this scale of rust. I'm just going to take kind of a ball peen hammer, smack the spring a couple of times, knock that all off of there. The next thing I need to do is remove this bolt. So sometimes you can get these to come loose, sometimes you have to cut them off. I'm going to try to unthread it, and to do that I'm going to use a drill with a wire brush on it, and I'm just going to kind of work around where the threads and the head of this are and clean it up. This is going to throw stuff all over, so I'm going to move the camera away. So before I remove this bolt, I was kind of looking at these. We have clamps on this spring pack, and I'm actually going to take these off first. And again, I'm not going to be able to get a great angle on it, but what I need to do is bend this tab back, and then bend this off here, and this clamp will come off. So there's one in the front, one in the back, and I'm not 100% sure if I'm even going to put these back on. I probably will because they help with spring alignment, and they're actually pretty loose, so that's fine. But we'll see. So I got to get these off first, so I'm going to do that now. I'm just going to use a chisel and probably a smaller hammer than that. Ooh. Alright, so I already set up the C-clamps here, but what you're going to do is try to remove this pin and use C-clamps to hold the springs together, because when this pin comes apart, these springs are going to want to spring apart. Honestly, on an old wore-out set like this, they're probably not going to come apart violently, but they will want to spring apart. Now, I like to get them closer to the center than what they are, but this is what I could make work on this particular setup. So I've got a clamp on this side, clamp on this side, and it should be pretty good. Now when we remove this bolt, I don't really like to put any heat in the spring area because it is spring steel, and if you heat and cool spring steel, you change its tempering and potentially crack it. So I'm going to just try to knock it off of here with an impact. We'll see what happens. And it's spinning the bottom, so I'll go grab some vice grips. Alright, so I got a set of vice grips on there. Don't know how long they're going to work. Not at all. And it's not moving at all. So unfortunately, this thing is not moving at all. I'm going to have to cut it. Definitely not my favorite thing to do, but I'm going to end up using a cutoff wheel. I'm going to try to cut just straight down and then be able to split the nut, and I'm going to have to be real careful that I don't get into the leaf spring itself. But I'm not going to turn the camera on for this because I'm going to have enough trouble doing it without the camera. So what I did there is I cut down through the center. I've got it cut almost to the spring. I'm going to take a chisel and try to knock the nut away and in half. Okay, so there's what's left of the nut. It split in half like I was hoping, and now I should be able to remove the center pin. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to loosen up these C-clamps one by one, and this center pin was actually spinning while we were trying to remove the nut, so I'm pretty sure it's not seized up in the center here. So I'll just do like a turnout on the one side, and you can see these springs starting to move apart. Okay, you can see the, actually I'm not sure if you can see that in frame or not. Let me move it. You can see the head of this bolt, or not the head, but the threaded end of this center bolt kind of dropping down into the center. And just kind of watch it, look at what's going on. You may need to loosen a little bit more on one side than the other. And as it comes down, we'll get to a point where there's less and less tension on these C-clamps. And just keep working it back and forth, side to side. Oh, one's about to fall off. Now these are basically at a point where there's not really much need for the C-clamp anymore. So I'll just take that off. Okay. Gonna hold it together. I may have taken the C-clamp off a little bit early, so I'll keep taking this one down. And now we're really to the point where this other C-clamp isn't doing much, except for being stuck. Okay, so get the other C-clamp out. Now all of the springs except for the main leaf is going to stay in the truck, or SUV in this case, and we'll take the rest of the pack, slide it out, and set it on the floor. Once it's on the floor, what I'll do is go ahead and slide this center bolt the rest of the way out. And you're going to want to hold on to that for just a minute to make sure you get the right size. Some of the newer ones are metric, some of the newer ones are quite large. Some of the new ones actually have more than one center bolt too. So we'll let the rust kind of fall out of there and just kind of let them sit like that. Alright, so I've got my add leaf. This is a long add leaf, so it's actually going to go mid-pack. They make them long or short, but I have an issue here with this one, and I'm going to show you what it is. So you can see this forward end, and Chrysler always uses a shorter, Chrysler generally uses a shorter forward piece and a longer back piece. So like from the center point, if you measure, it's a longer distance to the rear than it is to the front. So I've got this thing in here, it's going to be perfectly fine in the back. However, the front is going to run in to this leaf spring, and that bend is, I believe, a factory idea. I tried this spring both directions. It does not fit either way. So I'm going to have to trim this leaf spring to make it fit. Now, again, I don't really want to put heat into it, so I'm going to take this off on the floor, and I'll show you how I'm going to mark it out and cut it. So here's kind of what I did here. I figured out where this spring's going to go. So in the normal situation, the add leaf, the black leaf, is actually sitting where the main leaf would be. Then we've got our second leaf, our third leaf, the fourth, and the overload. Well, this spring is going to fit in between the second and third leaf, so right in here. Now I put the center bolt in just so I can rock this side to side while keeping it centered. And it's not tight, so you can see it's moving, but it's giving me a good enough location that I'm going to be able to do what I need to do. Now, the way I'm going to set this up is I'm going to come back just a little bit, and honestly, where this lands is probably not as critical as the fact that I want to take the same amount off both sides. So I just made a mark there of where I think I want to go. And actually I'm going to bring that back. I'm going to call it 3 3/4 of an inch. I'm going to cut off of this. Okay, so what I kind of did in that time warp thing is I cut this leaf spring off, which it's down on the ground. I used the cutoff wheel, which I'm not real crazy about because that did put some heat back into this. I didn't torch it because I didn't want to put the heat into it that torching it would. So here's the center pin that this addle leaf came with. Want to make sure that it roughly fits into the block. You want that to be a pretty good fit, and it is, because this controls whether your axle slides back or forth on the leaf spring. So set that thing up in there, and that's going to be a nice good center pin. I've already got my leaves kind of laid out here. Really, I just didn't move them from when I took them off the truck. So I slid this one away, but that's about all I moved. I'm just going to take my center pin and thread it through these leaves, and I'm going to have to set the camera down. Alright, so there is the center bolt installed in the pack. You can see that this addle leaf has a significantly larger arc than the rest of these. It's going to make clamping them back together a little bit more difficult, but this nice long center pin they gave you does have quite a bit sticking up the top to go through the other leaf spring and have its bolt threaded on, which is actually something you should check. You should make sure that this bolt runs all the way down the length of the center bolt. They get beat up in shipping. Sometimes you have to rethread them. In fact, this one I think I did. One of the two it came with, I had to run a tap down to get this thread straightened out. So we got this set up. Next is going to be sliding it up into the truck. When I go to slide this back in the truck, I'm going to want to try to be careful of the body work. I lifted this one up where this center pin has enough room to slide into its home. Okay. So there we go. I've now got that sitting up in place. Now I'm going to grab my clamps. I could probably just use the weight of the truck to push these up too, but I'm going to try to do it with clamps. So what I'm going to try to do is, as I compress this together, I'm going to keep these all lined up. Now you can beat them into position after they're put together, but I do like to try to keep them lined up. And I'm just going to try to watch this, which you can't really see from the angle you're at, but I want to keep the overload fairly level. You can do this with one C-clamp. I've done it with one C-clamp plenty of times, but it is easier with two. Okay, now you're not supposed to use this to hold the springs together, but I've got the bolt is kind of sticking down below, so I'm going to use the nut to pull the center bolt up through the spring back. Torque spec on this nut is going to be 17 foot-pounds by the manufacturer. It's a 3/8 24 bolt. So the actual torque spec on it, if you just go by size, is somewhere like, I didn't look it up, but it's something like 35. So I'm just going to crank this down a little bit. Meanwhile, what I'm really looking for is I want to make sure that there's no gaps in between any of these springs, which this one's kind of hard to see. I'm not sure how well it'll show up on camera, but it looks like we're actually pretty good. So I'm gonna go ahead and crank it down a little bit. Now this is way too long, obviously, but you also saw how helpful it is to have this bolt this long while you're installing it. So I'm not going to take it apart yet. There's enough clearance above it that it shouldn't have any issues when I put the truck back on the ground. And I like to make sure I'm happy with everything, and then after I'm happy with everything, I come back and I trim this off short. So it's not going to hit anything, it's not going to collect anything. But I'm not ready to trim it off until I have all 4 corners of the truck done. Alright, so obviously I am not actually torquing this. For one thing, the spec that it came with, 17 foot-pounds, seems very, very light to me for a fine thread 3/8 fastener. But I'm just going to go ahead, snug it down. It's good and tight. Again, there's no gaps anywhere here in the center around where the bolt goes through, which is what we're really looking for. Now I just left this plate on here, and there's a reason for that. This thing has rust fused itself together, and that means it's probably not going anywhere anytime soon. If I had taken it off, what I would want to do is clean up all the rust and scale and get that thing ready to go, which I kind of didn't do the greatest job on the top, but it's clean enough. So I've got the springs ready to go. Now what I need to do is take these C-clamps off. Okay, now from there I'm going to, because of the way this is set up on the hoist, I'm going to lower the truck down. If you're doing this off the ground, this would be where you start to lift the axle up. As it's coming in, you want to make sure that this pin is going to sit into the hole, which this one is actually doing real nice with, so I can continue to lower it. Okay, so we got down real close. It's now like almost there. I should be able to just take the leaf spring a little bit and then maybe grab the axle, and there we go, it just slipped into place. So I'm going to lower it down just a touch more, make sure all these springs are lined up the way they're supposed to. Now I've got this plate, which I took all the rust off the back side so it'll fit nice and flat. I'm going to set it back down into place. Okay, so I flattened it out a little bit, which is still kind of curved, but whatever. So we're going to leave that. When I crimp this down, it's actually going to kind of flatten out the spring pack there a little bit. Now I'm going to take my U-bolts that you should never reuse. Always buy new. You're always supposed to buy new U-bolts. You're not really supposed to reuse old ones. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and take my U-bolts, put them back into place. I'm totally reusing these U-bolts, but like I said, you're not really supposed to. I don't really see what that one's hanging up on, so I'm just going to give it a little tap. I mean, this is whatever. Now from there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my spring plate, which this one's got a little bit of a bend to it on the shock mount, but it's working fine for what I'm doing. Take the spring plate, shove the shock out of the way again. Sometimes you have to kind of press your U-bolts together at the bottom, make them go on. So we get those started, take our washer, and our nut. Start all 4 of them. Okay, so what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to tighten all 4 of these bolts up in an even amount. Okay, so I've got roughly the same amount of thread sticking out of each one of these. There is a torque spec on these as well, but what you're doing when you're torquing these down is you're actually forming this better to the top here, and you're stretching the U-bolt itself. So this is one of those things that you're gonna have to check. Drive this truck for like 100 miles or so, maybe even less. Check the 4 bolts, make sure nothing is loosening up. And you want to do that several times after you first put this back together. If you over tighten it, you can screw this up, and you can actually bend like your spring plate mount, which is not a good thing. But this is kind of as far as I'm going to go with this one for right now. It is snug, it's ready to do the other side, which I am not. So that's it. I've got a few more things left to hook up. I've still got this left to trim. If you've got new U-bolts that are too long, after you've got everything settled around, you can take those and trim them off as well. I'm going to try to bend this shock tap back before I finish everything up. But for right now, that's it. Kind of see where this goes. But thanks for watching. Hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you later. And so one of the other things I did here is I opened up the hole in this spring plate, and that allows a socket to come down in here. When you've put it back together with C-clamps and then tighten this down, sometimes as you tighten it down with the actual U-bolts, you'll compress it more and this center bolt will get loose. So what that does is allows you to drop a socket on there, and then again, this is a 3/8 bolt in this one, which the instructions call for 17 foot-pounds. So after you've got it clamped down, then you can tighten that up again and make sure it's actually tight.